Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today will be another unusual program. My old friend John Alexander is in the studio with me. He is the author of Reality Denied, First-Hand Experience with Things That Can't Happen But Did, as well as UFOs, Myths, Conspiracies, and Realities, and also Future War. John has had a many decades career in the military. He has his doctoral degree from Walden University. He's the past president of the International Association for Near-Death Studies. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Jeff. Glad to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you once again. You know, what's been in the news most recently, I think, regarding UFOs has been the revelation of the case that goes back to 2007 of the aircraft carrier Nimitz. In fact, right. An entire group of aircraft carrier group with many ships and airplanes, and I understand they observed tic-tac shaped UFOs, lozenge shaped UFOs for about a week. Many sightings.
Well, it was, and this was quite a consternation for them because what they saw were things that were, at altitude 80,000 feet, more than one or two, coming down at times literally on the deck on the ocean that seemed to be interacting with something that was subsurface. And then would zip off. Now, the tic-tac sighting that you're talking about is where the pilots went out and intercepted it, and so you had both radar sightings from the ships, radar on board the aircraft, and visual sightings from the pilot. So you have disciplinary things corroborating that a real event was taking place. And importantly, as you said, this went on for quite a period of time.
Mm-hmm. And I have seen the video.
It was formally released. Mm-hmm. Lou Alessandro, who was for DIA, who was the one running the study on it, and eventually retired to try and get the information out. Mm-hmm. But they did formally get it released by the Navy, a bit reluctantly, but nonetheless in the. And what we're led to believe is there are many other such tapes, and we may have seen within the past couple of weeks at the time that we're filming this, the Navy has put out a new policy mm-hmm. on reporting UFOs openly, and quite different from decades past.
And what's the difference?
The difference is they're going to make, supposedly, pilots are told to report seeing UFOs. Where this applies to only the Navy so far.
But in the past, pilots were sort of discouraged from reporting?
Oh, this is not career enhancing.
Yeah.
And it was kind of interesting that these files were, radar sightings were, stored in files, but there was great reluctance to come forth and so on. For several reasons. Embarrassment is one. The other from a pilot perspective, and we've seen this with many other cases where you get called in for psychological evaluation if you're seeing things that can't possibly be there. So the easiest approach is just don't report.
Yeah. So this particular case involves very good observations going on over an extended period of time of multiple vehicles, and the vehicles were able to engage in maneuvers that are well beyond the capability of our jet planes.
Oh, far beyond. Mm-hmm. As I said, they were at high altitude, low altitude, hovering near the ocean, high G, right angle
turns at high speed.
At things that humans would not survive mm-hmm. under our current understanding of, the engineering that would be necessary to do that. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it was amazing, and it went for a long time was just basically in the file. Quite frankly, the Navy, well, the government per se, does not like to engage in things that they can't explain.
Yeah.
And we are tied up. We should point out that, you know, at this juncture, we've technically been at war since 2001. And so for the last 18 years, been involved in conflict. Most of the resources and things that would go into that certainly do not want a distraction to go off into these other areas. Despite a lot of the people, probably the people watching this would say, "Oh, that's very, very interesting."
Yeah. Well, I presume that the government has made an evaluation and determined that whatever these things are, they don't pose a military threat.
Well, this goes back to the Condon report. Remember, we had Project Blue Book that went back through the 50s and 60s. There was Grudge and Sign before that, and then Blue Book, in which the Air Force was tasked to look at this, and they had officers who would report it. And they finally brought in what was known as the Colorado Report. And most people misunderstand. They think the question to Condon was, are UFOs real? It was not. It was, are UFOs a threat? The Department of Defense does just that. They do defense kinds of things.
Yeah.
And dealing with other abnormalities is not necessarily within their bailiwick. And it's a lot of it's resource constrained. You know, where are you going to put your resources? So when you do research in these areas, it takes money, and it means that you're not doing something else.
But it would seem to me that periodically, when new sightings keep occurring over and over again, which they do, the government needs to reevaluate. Is it still not a threat?
Well, and that's exactly what they did with this. But the other aspect is that, you know, what you were saying was so far beyond our capabilities.
Yeah.
Now, the big concern initially, of course, is this Soviet, using the bad old days, now Russia, is it Chinese? Is there some potential near-peer adversary who's made a big leap in technology? That would be of major concern. But when you can eliminate that, then the other goes into, well, this is interesting, and we'll watch it periodically.
And that's really the state of things right now with regard to the government.
Right. One of the things I point out, and I haven't lectured, there are 962 authorized flag slots in the Army, Navy, and Air Force, okay? Those are generals and admirals. I estimated that since Blue Book, that there's probably been about 6,000 people who have held that position. And if we guess that 10% of them have seen UFOs, and that's just based on, the government people see UFOs just like the general public. My question is, why haven't there been a hell of a lot more studies? And I do give an example. When I was doing a study, as you know, that I ran in the 80s, and I talked to a now retired 3-star who was the head of one of those 3-letter agencies. And what he said was, A, we don't do that because there's no institutional requirement to collect data, but I'll tell you about the ones I saw. So here he had personal experience, but that did not translate into him saying, you know, somebody figure out what this is.
Now, let me jump a bit, because recently I was at a UFO conference as a speaker, and there were other speakers at the conference. Some of them were the airmen and sailors, part of the Nimitz attack group, reporting on what they had seen. Many of them were still, after more than a decade, very, very profoundly moved by having had these sightings. But there were also people talking about a wide range of things that would have to fall into the realm of conspiracy theory, including crashed UFOs and cover-ups of crashed UFOs, but even more striking, many people believe, and the Gaia Network has been promoting, I think on over 100 episodes, although I think it's now discontinued, a fellow named Corey Good who talks about he's traveled many times to Mars where the U.S. government has secret bases, and Stephen Greer, a medical doctor, claims that the U.S. government has possessed UFO technology since the 1940s.
Yeah, well, at least the 50s on his website where he said we've had this technology. If so, treason has occurred. Because in my view, the issue of understanding UFOs being able to do these kinds of distances and time travel, etc., the fundamental issue here is energy. And, global climate change is one of the key issues at the moment, and we're wedded to carbon industries. If we had this sort of technology, the issue would not be can little widgets fly around, be kind of neat, but not nearly essential, as opposed to we'll change our energy system and all of the problems with coal burning and even nuclear would go away. So I think the evidence is strongly against. I might mention the Mars base, and it was something we had talked about privately before. When you start thinking about that, and there was a researcher who we both know who had written and said, flights slip out of Canaveral all of the time. And the answer is no. When we launch from Cape Canaveral, half of Florida is aware because you see these are going up. And you start thinking about the logistical requirements that it would take to maintain a base on Mars. And it just belies all kind of logic.
Well, I have heard, to push the conspiracy argument further, those who point to a news story that shows that I think the Pentagon has been unable to account for about $1 trillion over the years, and that's funding the secret space program.
Well, the people who say that don't understand the funding process at all. Now, in fairness, and one of the things that does bring that up is literally the day before 9/11, Rumsfeld, who was then Secretary of Defense, came forward and said, $1 trillion is missing and all that. Now, to say it's missing is very different from saying our accounting system is not nearly as good as it should be. One of the things I point out is very few people, even in the military or other parts of the government, understand how the government is funded and how the system works. And what you have is a 1 to N priority list of things that you must do, and then you get down to things you want to do, and then things that would be nice to do. Well, you run out of money probably long before the things you must do. And there's tremendous competition for the dollars in both the white and what you colloquially call the black world.
And in other words, even in the so-called deep state black world, there are people competing for the available dollars.
Well, first of all, just so we know, I come down against the deep state, if you will. These are basically career employees who have been there for decades, and we used to call it the B team. When they would take over and have people they didn't like, they say, I be here when you come, I be here when you leave. And their job was to maintain stability, if you will, and what they thought was done. That's far different than the attempted coups that we're now hearing about. But the competition, I'll give you an example. The study that you mentioned that followed the Nimitz sighting, and you hear about the $22 million that was allocated, and that was over a period of years. Not in our bank account, but by DOD standards, we're not talking lunch money, okay? And I do know that one of the things that happened is they put out these requirements that said, we do advanced threats. And other people came along and said, wait a minute, we do advanced aerial threats, and went in and snatched the money. So that's not something that the outside public would see, but the competition internally is absolutely fierce. But one of the things that used to get me, I worked, as you mentioned, I was actually in the Pentagon for a while. And one of the favorite things is people say, I'm going to go find the money. Well, there are no pots of money. When you say I'm going to find the money, it means you're going to raid somebody else's program or try to find something where the funds have not been able. No, we have a terrible system on allocation of funds and how they must be committed by a certain time, or you what they call use or lose, which does lead to a fair amount of probably not the best use of resources. We also are on a 5-year funding cycle, and so you have to program out. A lot of that is run by the comptrollers, and they know deck about the projects. All they're saying, do the curves look right? In the funding level, it doesn't take into account. At a certain time, you may need to have a big jump in funding, or you may need to buy something that's really expensive, which will change the projection.
So the $1 trillion that Rumsfeld spoke of, it's really not a question of the money's just missing. It's more a question of it may not have been accounted for properly.
Remember, again, literally the day before 9/11. So he was really getting ready from a political standpoint to take on the military-industrial complex and try to make big changes, and some of which were needed, by the way, in the accounting systems and all that. And when 9/11 hit, everything went out the window, and we did start sending. They complain about pallets of money. Yeah, they were literally, if they went into Iraq, sending pallets of money to reconstitute the system in Iraq.
Well, of course, just bringing up the phrase 9/11 evokes all kinds of conspiracy theories, and it dawned on me thinking about the notion of conspiracy theories in general. Some people think it's a legitimate academic field of study, conspiracy theory, and it dawned on me that two things. First of all, many viewers of this program, because I talk about parapsychology, which is considered by many a pseudoscience or a non-science. There are people, there are people who think there's a conspiracy to suppress data in parapsychology. But it dawned on me that the oldest conspiracy theory that I can think of would be Gnosticism as a whole. The idea that our entire planet has been taken over by a counterfeit God who's pretending to be the real God and is running things, the archons, that there are, in effect, spiritual entities who shouldn't be running this planet but are. That's sort of the basis of many conspiracy theories.
Well, you do. You have these celestial fights that are going on between demons and archdemons and archangels and your name of
the war in heaven. It's an old idea.
And that we're just the battleground.
Our minds, our very brains, our consciousness is the battleground for spiritual entities.
But one of the things, remember, very early in my presentations, I say, if you're going to study any of these areas, and UFOs, there's three things that you need. One is you better have thick skin because you're going to be attacked. I don't care what your position is, somebody is going to attack you. One is you better have a day job because very few people are making any substantial amount of monies in this. And the third is you must understand conspiracy theory because either you believe there's a conspiracy in that, or if you don't, you're part of the cover-up.
And many people have accused you of exactly that.
Of course.
It happens all the time, and you, how do you deal with that?
Like I said, rule one, you better have thick skin. And you try to ignore it. I mean, some of it, the noise level gets up every once in a while. And unfortunately, as we're seeing, and we have discussed in other areas related to what's going on now, but, rationalism is kind of tough to come by, and understanding why people believe some of the things they do and the implications of it once they have accepted a belief system, and trying to change that, it's to be very, very difficult.
I understand that. I've certainly, after many of my videos, people will post comments from the perspective of one or another conspiracy theory. I've heard that all the problems in the world are due to the Freemasons, or they're due to the Jews, or they're due to the Catholics, or it's usually the Nazis or the anti-fascists,
the trilateralists, and the Bundesburgers,
and the Illuminati.
Bilderbergers.
And people seem to be wanting to find somebody to blame.
One of the issues that might surprise folks is they generally come down against secrecy. And I've been talking recently about in the UFO community, do you even want the government involved? Because they bring a number of things. They have some excellent sensor systems that are not available in the public world. Got some brain power, particularly if you look at national laboratories, and some other things. But you bring the propensity to classify, and the problem with classification is it leads to exactly what you're discussing here. If we don't understand it, there must be some controlling mechanism behind it, some nefarious purpose, some of the great they, and we've never understood who they are. I mean, there's a host of theys out there. I'll give you a specific example. I've worked with the Council on Foreign Relations. This is in weapons research. And there's a general popular belief that this is a megalithic entity that thinks all in one. And I can tell you in there, they come from a wide variety of belief systems and have their own agendas and whatnot, and they fight fiercely. It is not a concerted effort of how do we control the world.
Well, I'm inclined to think that the world is very pluralistic, and to the extent that conspiracies do exist there, it's not like a mastermind control over the whole world.
Oh, absolutely. But again, I think the whole issue of secrecy kind of generates and fosters these conspiracy theories. And that's why real transparency is probably one of the best things we can do in this area. As you know, I've also said, if we're dealing with UFOs in particular, but as you know, my basis is that there are a broad range of phenomena, all of which are related. I would also say that, in my view, that this is at least as complex as cancer, if not. And if we're going to approach it, what we need to do is, rather than sequestering data and hoarding it, which is the propensity now, is you need to make it as widely available as possible and have integrated studies. I even called for looking at the Human Genome Project and saying what we need is a Human Genome Project-like entity on steroids, probably about 2 orders of magnitude, should be $300 billion, to tackle the complexity of this issue.
Well, I just had a guest on the program, a mutual friend and colleague, Beverly Rubik, who argued that we need something equivalent to the Human Genome Project to study energy psychology and or energy biology, to look at the human being not just as a collection of molecules, but as a collection of frequencies.
But the point. But the Human Genome Project is an excellent one. Came in under budget and in under time in about 9 years. And there were about 3 billion pairs that had to be adjusted.
30 different universities across many different countries.
That's the point. The multiple universities, multiple countries sharing data.
I understand, because I've done some interviews recently about it, that at the end of the day, yes, they decoded the human genome. Very important, very important. I don't want to minimize the accomplishment, but what they discovered is that the human genome accounts for a very small portion of human behavior. It doesn't account for all behavior as it was once hypothesized.
Well, behavior and biology are a little bit different, obviously.
Well, what they've discovered, of course, is that in addition to the genes, you have to look at the epigenetic factors. So now I understand there is a consortium to explore epigenetics.
And these will go on. I mean, one of the things I point out when you start getting into any of these studies, wherever you go, about the time you think you got it really figured out, you also find out there's a whole new order of magnitude of complexity that you must deal with.
Yeah.
In fact, I had called, as in the past, my law of appropriate complexity, that people deal with things until they've almost got it figured out, and this appears at all level, and then all of a sudden it's, wow, look at what else is that. And this is an admonition for people who want to study phenomenology.
Mm-hmm.
You usually start in with a personal incident or something happened, and I want to study this. Mm-hmm. And the more you get into it, as you demonstrate by this program and your guest, it gets broader and broader and broader.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you suggest, for example, that UFOs are not unrelated to near-death experience.
Well, I think in consciousness that is the key factor, and it crosses many things from psychokinesis. You know, we've done lots of work with shamans around the world. Yeah. We've had experiences that, hence the name of the book, things that can't happen, but we've seen happen firsthand.
Yeah.
I point out that if you deal with the spirit world and question in UFOs, are these real? Is it ET? I come down against the extraterrestrial hypothesis just because it's too simple. But we have had humans interacting with sentient non-humans throughout the entirety of human history in all cultures. Mm-hmm. And that they happen to fly in little metal vessels is relatively new wrinkle to that, even though UFOs have been around for a long time.
I mean, they used to call them chariots.
Well, like I say, this goes on back literally centuries and millennia. Yeah. But you also have, as you know, other kinds of spirits, from fairies and elves, right, and all the stories, the Menahuni. Again, every culture has them.
An entire supersensible universe.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so the question, if these are interrelated, how does that work? Mm-hmm. And there, as I say, there does appear to be a piece of human consciousness that's sort of the cross-cutting. I point out that, as you know, we've traveled all over the world, as have you, and you start dealing in other cultures. The basic assumption in America is, hey, it's a materialistic paradigm that we're in. We also think that everybody thinks like us, mm-hmm, and is educated in the same way. What we find, particularly with the spirit world, when you're dealing with developing nations and whatnot, their notion of interaction with the spirit world is very different from ours. We talk about, in the West, if you believe, I mean, you may not even believe, but if you do, there's a spirit world and the real world, and they're separate and distinct. But when I deal with the shamans, they move seamlessly back and forth, and sometimes talking to them is kind of hard to figure out. Are we talking about this world where we're sitting and talking now, mm-hmm, versus the other? I'll give an example. We were in West Africa, and shamans there, where his job is to dream and find out what the future is going to be
for the community.
Yeah. And this isn't voodoo, which is far more than a religion, mm-hmm, actually a way of life. Mm-hmm. But from a spiritual perspective, if you go out and you're going to pick fruit or pick something, you ask permission, mm-hmm, from the things that for sustenance to come into you. Again, very, very different from going to the grocery store and grabbing an avocado or whatever.
It's a completely different mindset. And if we go back historically, even in our culture 200-300 years ago, witches were being burned at the stake.
Yeah. Well, this is where, and even today, mm-hmm, in some cultures, having these extrasensory capabilities can be life-threatening. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Well, jumping around some more, our mutual friend and colleague, Jacques Vallée, studied UFOs extensively, and I think he's been the strongest proponent of saying we should try to evaluate UFO phenomena in the context of all of these shamanistic and folklore and mythological traditions that will gain many insights. He has also postulated the idea that UFOs are part of a control system, that there's an effort by some unknown group to manipulate the evolution of the human species at a subconscious level, and that UFOs are part of that.
Well, and one of the hypotheses that's actually gaining more traction is that we are they. meaning we're part of a genetic experiment that Earth was seeding with humans, and at some point they either created us or at least interacted and dramatically changed the direction that the species were taken.
Yeah.
As I said, even in the academic worlds, that's gaining a bit more traction.
Well, because we now ourselves have the capability of engaging in genetic engineering and conducting experiments of a similar nature, and it's not hard to imagine in another 1,000 years or so we could apply that technology on other planets.
Yeah. But as you know, I worked with Bob Bigelow at the it was called Skinwalker Ranch.
Yes.
The whole program's around that.
Yes.
And I came away with a notion that I called the precognitive sentient phenomena. And that really applies, I think, to your suggestion here. And that was that there was a they. And it was always one step ahead. And many people who have studied phenomena, I've had several of them where you study it, you're doing instrumentation, and you don't get any results, and then just off camera something happens or something else comes. And the phenomena itself keeps morphing. And it's like whatever it is in control, and says, oh, you like that? Try this, and you get something totally different.
George Hansen, a parapsychologist, has written a book called Parapsychology and the Trickster, and he talks about the trickster archetype, which is very prominent in many shamanistic traditions here in the American Southwest. The character Coco Paley you see everywhere is a trickster.
Well, that's very true. Kripal has done a lot of work.
Jeffrey
in that area as
Kripal,
well. Yes.
So it suggests that, within the human psyche, within what Carl Jung called the collective unconscious, are these archetypal forces, and that, as Pogo has once said, we have met the enemy and it is us.
Yes. Well, very true. And the trickster has certainly been there. And part of the problem, again, gets back to the materialistic belief system that we can cut things into smaller and smaller pieces. We're looking for the God particle as the fundamental building block of reality. And again, the things that I've seen just defy various laws of physics. One of my classics in thermodynamics and watching in voodoo with people who, stand in the fire, sit in the fire, eat the fire. The arcane explanations that the skeptics come up with, like they have some miracle substance that they put on that protects them and all, it just makes no sense whatsoever. And yet you look at, for me, it's the interest is in the outliers. The laws apply and work very well. When I flip a switch, the light comes on, I understand that. The more interesting is when you flip the switch and the light doesn't come on. And this is true in many, many areas. Near death, you had asked about that earlier. The example, I like Mary Neal case, for example. She was kayaking in Chile and goes over a waterfall and gets wedged underwater probably for 30 minutes.
She's a medical doctor.
She is an MD, a surgeon in her own right. The complexity of the case just goes on up. But the point is, she's underwater for 30 minutes. What we know, nobody's going to hold their breath that long, particularly when you're having the water beat down on you. And that 99.999% of the people who are underwater that long will die. Interesting story about that, but it's really interesting when you find these cases didn't die. There was a case that just occurred in Norway, I think it was on 60 Minutes, in which somebody fell through the ice and was underwater for a similar length of time, and they bring him out. Again, 99% of the people who had been under the ice for that long would have died, and yet come out and able to revive them. So it's the outliers, to me, that are the most interesting and deserve study.
Well, reflecting on that, because I've recently done some conversations on epigenetics, are some studies in cultures where people do a lot of diving and deep sea divers in some of these Polynesian islands are able to stay underwater for about 20 minutes, and studies have been done showing that they have modified epigenetically the activation of certain genes that enable them to require less oxygen. So that they can do that.
But that's a case where you have people who are doing this repeatedly and changing.
That's
the
right.
The ones I'm talking about are accidental.
Right.
And
instantaneous.
We do know that most of them drown.
Yeah, but they don't all. And it strikes me that if I had to find one unifying factor that could explain all these diverse phenomenon, it would be something along the lines that we need a new paradigm completely, that the materialistic paradigm, that the bottom line, what some philosophers call the primitive, it's not molecules and quarks and subatomic particles, it's consciousness itself.
Correct. And we're not alone. Max Planck believed this too.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's not like it's a new thought, but it's one that's sort of been, pushed to the side and I think part of it has to do though with practicality. Again, if I go back, just flip the switch, the light comes on. If my objective is to turn on the light, that's really good.
The materialistic paradigm is incredibly seductive.
Correct.
But it may not be accurate. Just because it works most of the time, it may not be an accurate description of reality.
Well, I don't think it is. And, we talked about research and funding for research and things like that. As you know, with the Large Hadron Collider, we have put, my guess is about $17 billion into that, looking for the God particle, if you will. If you found that, and people do look at it, it would be of intense interest to a tiny subset of theoretical physicists.
Right.
Conversely, continuation of consciousness beyond physical death ought to be of interest to 100% of the population. And we think that is where we ought to be focusing a lot more research. And again, it's these outliers and from near-death experiences, particularly ones that are instrumented or ones where the circumstances are such that survival was impossible and yet did happen. And they come back with, let me tell you what happened when it was out there. In Mary Neal's case, not only was it current and going out and talking to God and that sort of thing, but being given precognitive information. And in fact, last summer, one of the things she said, there were other things that she has not yet revealed that were given to her at that time.
Well, it's quite interesting how people experiencing out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, also seem to get accurate precognitive information. Elizabeth Crone, the lady who was the subject of the book Changed in a Flash by Jeffrey Kripal, co-authored by Elizabeth and Jeffrey Kripal, was struck by lightning and had the same experience.
In Native American, we used to have lightning shamans that after they were hit by lightning had these interesting capabilities. I mean, as you know, we were in Mongolia dealing with a reindeer shaman and all that. Everybody's, so now we have people who want to be shamans and get shaman certified and all that. These cultures, that's basically not a good thing initially. You go through a tremendous trial period. You're usually an outcast or deemed as crazy and thrown out of your society before you gain the capabilities to show, hey, there are things we can do like being precognitive or healing capabilities and those sorts of things, and then get reintegrated. But it's usually not a very safe and easy process.
No, the shamans are traditionally called the wounded healers. They have to suffer a transformational illness and heal themselves.
Yeah. No, it's a process, and it's not one where you're going to take a few courses online and get a shaman certification.
But I wonder if our culture as a whole needs to go through a process like that we become healed, because it does seem in many, many regards humanity is sick.
The question is, as you know, like with the shamans who get outcasts and that, none of them don't make it.
Yeah.
You know, the issue with all of these phenomena we talk about, we talk to the survivors.
Right.
There are others.
Well, it would seem that humanity on this planet has reached a point where our very survival is being threatened by ourselves.
Yes. Well, the whole climate change, among things, or abuse of resources. Like take the U.S., the 4% of the population of the world, it uses 25% of the resources, and particularly in energy and things. Unsustainable.
Or the fact that half the world is obese and the other half is malnourished.
Yes. And, well, I'll give you one. As you know, there's a big issue on doing away with malaria. Everybody would say, well, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
And we'll agree with that. But if everybody survives and either doesn't get malaria or survives it, that means that the population growth increases.
Yeah.
So you have these other unintended consequences that altruistically would be seen as a good thing, but then you have a commitment of resources and reality on the other side. How are you going to feed them? And
because of population growth, for example, in India, I know the water table is being depleted.
well, that's true in many areas. You know, I'm from Las Vegas, and we are in severe drought, meaning for a number of years. And you know, Lake Mead itself is going down, and underground aquifer is being drained. Something that needs serious consideration. You know, as we know, the global climate change is real. It is a significant problem, and politically trying to deny that is just a potential, you know, disaster. And the question you raised: does humanity survive?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we're confronting the potential that we might not. After all, many species have come and gone before us.
Yeah, but you know, there is, again, you know, the belief system, the thing, well, we're so important that we must survive. And you go, really?
If you consider the fact that there are billions of potentially habitable planets that might develop intelligent life forms, it's fair to think that some of them are going to go extinct at their own because of their own actions.
Well, the first question, though, is there life elsewhere in the universe? And that mathematically is yes. And that's just based on pure math. I think we're up to, 200 billion habitable planets someplace, and that number keeps growing. It wasn't but a few years ago we thought of one or two might be out there, and now we know that throughout the universe there's many. And so just the probability, even if you're on a pure evolutionary approach, you know, the material world sort of thing says, yeah, someplace, something like us evolved someplace else.
I think the interesting thing about the existence of UFOs or UAPs, as some people like to call them these days, is it does provoke us to think about big picture questions like, you know, the survival of humanity.
Well, again, I think all of these phenomena that we've talked about here, and there's a host of others, as you know, drive us in that direction at looking at big picture questions. I think one of the things we haven't discussed is that the notion of separateness, of whether we're separate and independent. Of course, we agree that, you know, there's kind of a universal consciousness and that we are part of it, and the notion of being separateness is an illusion, albeit a very persistent one. And I've been arguing recently, you know, we've been in America first and all of that, and what I put out, you know, I said, if you're thinking globally, you're thinking too small. That, you know, the interconnection is even bigger than that. And that when you harm others, you are in fact harming yourself. When
you're thinking globally, you're thinking too small. That reminds me of the notion that our very molecules are formed from the explosion of distant supernovas.
Right. I mean, and again, the one mind, as Larry Dossey put it, you know, that permeates everything.
Well, I like that idea of one consciousness. I think it's an extremely important idea. As you pointed out earlier, Max Planck, the founder of quantum physics, expressed it very clearly. He suggested you can't get beneath consciousness. It is.
Right.
It is.
From consciousness rises material.
Yeah. The whole material universe exists within consciousness. It's easy to say those words, but they're so profound. I think it may take really the most brilliant thinkers on the planet many, many decades, if not generations, to really absorb the impact of what that means.
But I think the important issue there is, that's exactly what is needed, but getting them oriented away from this, where educational systems become involved that are steeped in materialistic belief systems. We reward people in physical sciences to work in narrow issues that push the envelope. Is thinking on the Max Planck level, that takes a whole nother level of thinking, and we don't generally reward those. And one of the things I've said, I have an agenda, and that's to try and assist and make it a principle for the best and brightest to be involved in these things. And as we know from many of our friends, these can be strong negatives in the academic or scientific world.
Because it's considered foolishness, and people will use the horse laugh. Oh, you believe in those woo-woo things.
Well, as I said, the illusion is very persistent.
It is very persistent, and there are all sorts of economic incentives to keep it going the way it is going. But those very same economic incentives are the one that are leading the human race to the brink of disaster.
Right. No, I don't think there's any doubt about that. Economics drives probably too much. But again, you're back to your belief system. Many of the people I've dealt with around the world, so many shamans, I use the term look up to dirt, and when we're talking about a poverty level, and yet their understanding of the environment that they're in there, and happiness, by the way, we haven't talked about happiness quotients and those sort of things. They're better off than many of the rich folks that we know.
Well, yes, there's something, as my sister loves to say, is money can't buy you happiness, but it sure will let you choose your own form of misery.
Oh, yes.
And it does seem to be the case that many people, and I know personally people who are extraordinarily wealthy who are miserable.
Oh, yes. No, we have joint friends who are like that, who are very unhappy people. Victoria likes to talk about there are a certain subset, and they have certain privileges and access to medicine and capability. Now, certainly they do get some treatments that are different. My classic example there is John F. Kennedy, as president, has his son die and has access to all of the capabilities available. So this also is in the conspiracy realm of assuming that there's a dark something that's out there that is going to impact.
Well, this is where the whole question of survival after death becomes crucial, because no matter how wealthy you are, you're going to die just like every other human.
Well, most of them are. We have had a couple of cases where they say that hasn't happened. No, I think it's sort of inevitable, and this is why I mentioned. My guess is, and I've said this several times, when you look at purely money, probably in the world there's about $10 million per year going into research in all of these phenomena, UFO, near-death studies, et cetera, et cetera. And again, you compare that to the materialistic point, illness, cancer, it just pales. And yet, again, as you mentioned, ought to be of interest to 100% of the population. Why do we do it? Now, we do run into issues of overt control mechanisms, meaning religion and things like that. And one of the things I've talked about is, as we've worked with ayahuasca, near-death experiences. I was surprised, frankly, as we got into that, how many religions, not all, I mean, there's some practitioners who are very supportive, but do not want you to deal with any of these phenomena.
They consider it's their domain.
That's right. And what they are going to do is, there's certain dogma that is set out, and if there's any changes, they're going to be the ones to, present the information. The ideal of having direct experience yourself runs against a very strong power structure.
Well, and our mutual colleague Stefan Schwartz, who's been a guest on my program many times, believes it all goes back to the Council of Trent, which it was many hundreds of years ago, when the church engaged in various rulings that the material world belongs to science, but everything else, the realm of consciousness, is the domain of the church.
But again, that's kind of a Caucasian Western viewpoint in and of itself, because you do see the same considerations in other cultures.
Yeah.
The priests are the ones who are going to impart wisdom, and
well, it gets infinitely complex.
It is.
John Alexander, once again, this has been a delightful conversation. I'm really pleased that you come here to Albuquerque to be with me. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
And thank you for being with us.